Today, Africans around the world are celebrating their diversity, cultures, and more importantly, the spirit of Ubuntu. As we mark Africa Day, also known as Africa Liberation Day, for 6 decades, Africa Day has served as a powerful symbol of Africa's journey towards liberation, independence, and collective self-determination. Happy Africa Day to you, our cherished African viewers. This day is a reminder of the tremendous strides Africa has made in areas such as education, health, infrastructure, governance, and technology. It is also a stark acknowledgement of the unaccomplished task unaccomplished tasks by African countries, one of which we will focus on today is modern-day slavery. According to Walk Free, there are 7 million Africans engaged in modern-day slavery all over the world. In their latest report, the Global Slavery Index, it is indicated that modern-day slavery has shot up since 2018, and the continent is the most vulnerable. So who are these slave drivers, you ask? The US, Russia, China, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, among others, according to the Walk Free report. Now, Canada, Australia, Germany, and Norway are singled out as those developed countries that have moved to do something about the exploitation brought on by the global economy. You're welcome to The Square. I am Keminni, Amanor. Joining our program today are Maliba Arnold. He's a public policy analyst. He's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. We also have from Abuja, Nigeria, Pan Africanist Tamunokuro Iyo Obietonbara. Gentlemen, you're welcome to The Square.
Thank you.
And Iyo, I hope I got your name right. On a day like this, yes, we should know each other's names.
Yeah, you did. I'll give you a pass.
Thank you. But let's have a conversation. And I'll start with you, Tamuno. What are the reflections you're making on this day?
Yeah, a remarkable day, considering where we are coming from as a people and as a continent. You know, the last 400 years has been filled with lots of atrocities committed against us African people, from the transatlantic slave trade to colonialism, you know, and which actually began in 1884, 1885, when, you know, some people sat down in a conference hall somewhere in Germany and decided to carve the continent to themselves. And in the 50s and 60s, of course, you know, many Africans started revolting against these strange enemy forces. And today we have, you know, what is known as neocolonialism, which is, you know, in my opinion, far more dangerous than direct colonialism. So, but in all of this, despite the crisis we've had, you know, in Nigeria, in the Congo, in Liberia, you know, in Zimbabwe, despite the crisis we've had, you know, in Mozambique, across the continent, in Ethiopia, you know, we've also been able to achieve some level of economic, you know, prosperity. We've achieved, you know, educational growth, you know, so it is not. There's a lot to celebrate, even though there's so much more to work on. You know, there's so much to celebrate. You know, considering where we are coming from, in less than 60 years, you know, we've been able to do so much for ourselves. You know, we should give ourselves a pass. We could do better. There is so much we can do, but we should give ourselves some credit.
And I want us to look at some of those things that we need to do better. But before that, let me move on to Maliba now. Maliba, 60 years of, you know, Africa, 60 years, well, much more than that. But, you know, in the context that I'm speaking, 60 years of the African journey towards liberation, independence, and what would be your assessment of how far we have come?
You know, when you tell the story of Africa, it is actually the story of humanity. It is the story of mankind, as it were, because 60 years is quite a small dot for where we've come from as a people. And literally, when we talk about humanity, not just the out of Africa theory, But for all the theories that have been posited, it is actually obvious that all human beings started here in Africa. Like I sometimes say that if any human being has not ever, or rather has never come to Africa, then they have never been home, because it is here in Africa that we became human. It is here that we became who we are. And then from Africa, of course, the savannas of East Africa, that is where mankind grew and then spread to the rest of the world. So when you talk about the story of Africa, you're talking about the story of mankind. And the story of mankind goes back to the simple thing about a story, that the difference between we human beings and other animals is an anthropological statement that the difference between we human beings and other animals is that we are storytelling animals. So it's important that we tell our stories correctly. When we tell the story of Africa, it needs to go back to the very beginning, from where we started as a people. Our story, of course, is quite short, seeing that a lot of it is lost in history. And then as we move forward and look into the future, we very much forget where we've come from and the essence of who we are. So 60 years, good, of course, we are talking about liberation, we are talking about freedom. And then beyond that, you still realize that we've really not made so much progress.
Indeed.
Like he said earlier on, we've got neocolonialism now here. That's quite a complex subject that needs much more than the brown we used to gain independence, or rather self-rule. And as the world moves forward, as things move quite fast, and we have got a generation of primarily today, you are not able to tell the story of Africa without talking about the youth, because 60% of Africans were born in the last 24 years. Africa is actually the youngest continent. And that, in and of itself, means that we really have to start telling the story of Africa differently, because we are the youngest continent, even though we are the oldest, because all mankind, the story of mankind started here.
I see. Now, I'll stay with you, Maliba, on that. And let's talk about the areas of development that, in your opinion, Africa has done quite well, over the last 60 years.
In the last 60 years, there's one thing we never actually give ourselves credit for. If you look at Europe, for example, Europe is actually, in my opinion, we've done well at integration, as opposed to other people who actually tell us about integration. See this, if you looked at African or rather European countries, they are almost uniformly ethnic, of course, with a little bit of dots with the people who've come in. But if you went to UK, you are just going to find the English and the Welsh, people who share a long tradition of where they've come from. If you went to Germans, they're almost nearly all Germans. If you went to Italy, they are almost always Italians. But if you came to Africa, for example, you will actually realize that we've done well in the last 60 years. As much as people talk about ethnic strife, tribal problems, we have done very well. For example, if you are to come to Kenya, you will actually realize that we are about 42 sub-nations. People who speak languages that you would group together, whether it is the Congo, Niger, or Atlantic Congo, what we call Bantu, but they still have got distinct nationalities from where they come from. You wouldn't find that very easily in Europe. So on the aspect of integration, we have done well. We still have got challenges, but you cannot compare Africa with our friends in the West, for example. On that particular, it's quite difficult. 60 years is quite a short time if you are to compare what so many African countries have actually done. Today, everybody will admire the US, for example, but we are talking about 200 years plus of democracy. Not the same with 50, 60 years that the oldest countries that have been free in Africa have been there. So we've done quite well on integration, social and ethnic integration. We've also quite tried to catch up, because we now have quite a dynamic workforce. We've got problems with governance, but telling the African story from a weeping point is actually the wrong way of telling the story, the African story.
I'll come back to you and we'll look at, Maliba, I'll come back to you and we'll look at telling the story and how to tell the African story. But let me move on to Tamono now. Tamono, You said you'd give, the continent a pass on how far it has come. What are the areas that you're given that pass to?
Well, if you look, for instance, and this is not me trying to play down on the failures of our leadership, but if you compare African countries to countries like Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, these countries have gotten independence for almost 150 years or thereabout. But if you compare the level of education in Africa to these countries, we are doing much more better. Even in terms of our economies, despite, like I said, the failures, we're not doing so bad. Right now in Nigeria, I can do instant money transfers. Do you know that you can do instant money transfers in the US? Money transfers in the US take days, but I can send you money right now within seconds. You receive it. In so-called developed countries, these things are not happening. We offer M-Pesa in Kenya. The entrepreneurial spirit of Africans, is something that is just so unstoppable. So, the number of educated Africans in the last 60 years is astronomical. When we were under direct colonialism, in some cases, they even stopped Africans, from having secondary education. But right now, we have, take Nigeria, for instance. We've got thousands of universities that are doing so well. We have some of the best doctors on the planet. We have some of the best scientists in the world. But again, there is one thing to achieve colonialism. There is another thing to achieve colonialism of the mind. Our biggest problem as a people is mental, because we have not, been able to purge ourselves from the, informations that we've received over the years, from the colonialists. So we find it difficult to make use of the talents that we have all around us, because a black doctor, even though people all over the world are looking for black doctors, but we tend to have, we tend to be more at peace. We tend to have more respect when the doctor attending to us is not an African. When he's a European, we give more credit and we think they're doing, they'll be much more better. So our problem has been our states of mind, because we got colonized mentally. And that's the only way, of course, you can colonize anyone. Yeah, that's why it's called colonization. You're making a clone of the person, and then a clone is a robot, just like like an android. You simply tell the robot to do what to say, So there is so much, even in terms of our countries. Most of our countries are doing better. They're doing well.
Amazing.
We have instabilities here and there, but there is progress.
Indeed. Now, Maliba, I come to you now. I know both of you have spoken about the leadership and the governance challenges of the country, of the continent, and I wouldn't want us to belabor that point, but something of real importance that you speak about is telling our own stories and telling it right. And if I am paraphrasing this African proverb right, until the lion learns to tell their own stories, the hunter is always victorious. And so if we want to tell our story, how do we tell our stories the right way? What is the story that we should be telling, given our very limited historical archives, if that makes sense?
When you are looking at the African story, like I said earlier on, everybody agrees. People have really tried to tell the origin of mankind, whether it's religious, whether it is anthropological. You still find that we come back to Africa. This is the cradle of mankind. And to be fair, of course, about 100, 120 years ago, we as Africans, of course, lost our culture. We lost the way we used to do things. When colonialism came, and way before, of course, that there was slavery that had been going on for a while. But about 120 years ago, we lost our culture. We were disorganized. The whole way, the way we knew the world was disorganized when colonialism set in. But if you look at 60 years ago, we have fought back and caught up with the rest of the world. I just need to remind everybody watching that the Europe we see today is largely built on African wealth. Because colonialism was about extraction, extracting our raw resources and even human resource. Because if you look at the US, for example, it is the black labor that worked in the cotton fields. And from the cotton fields, when America was, for example, supplying 91% of the world's cotton, it is from there that they raised the capital that then brought them into the industrial age. It's still African resources doing that. You go to to Europe, to the West, you will still find that it's the African resources that they have built on a culture where they are today. But where did we begin? We began from a place where our resources have been exploited. We are beginning from a place where we were, I don't know whether to say de-educated or diseducated. Then we have had to catch up with the world, and we are doing very well. I have been doing consulting across the world, likely in Africa and a little bit across the Atlantic. And I just need to actually say this, that even though I am almost 80% educated and trained in Kenya, I have realized that a lot of times the people we look at and revere because just sometimes of their skin color, when we sit down to work, you realize that you educated in Africa, you are much better. Indeed. So it's important for us to get to a place where continuously through the media, the way we do governance, we start to tell our story in a way that actually gives us dignity. And we don't need to import dignity. The problem has been that the story of Africa that actually goes out there is always the sob story. Of course, as journalists, you know that the sob story sells. But the problem is that it does not build the quote unquote the victims. So we as a people, we have got a rich heritage, we have got a rich history. We just need to tell it right. We need to document it, and we need to just go forth and realize that a lot of our problems will be solved here. Because a lot of times when we're looking for help, even from the Bretton Woods institutions, when he spoke about neocolonialism, there's nothing better that exemplifies neocolonialism like the Bretton Woods institutions. If we did and took care of our issues, you know, the best of the European countries, if they never had looted Africa, the best of them would look like the way Russia looks today. Indeed. And if Russia, except for the size, the size they have, and a lot of natural resources, talking about oil, you know that in most places in Russia, a lot of African places are much better. You've gone to Germany, you will realize there are places where they do not, you cannot even make a mobile phone call. There are places where the internet in Germany is
Maliba, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you and would look at whether or not as Africans we are learning our hidden stories. Because if we have to tell the story, being African by birth is no longer enough. Are we learning our stories the right way? But I'll move on to Tamuno now. Tamuno, and feel free to take a dig at the question I posed to Maliba earlier. But what I really want to find out from you is on the spirit of unity. How far have we come? What are we doing wrong? What should we be doing right going forward, Tamuno?
Thank you. And I'm glad you asked the question of unity. But, you know, just to, you know, add a little bit to what, you know, my brother from Kenya was talking about earlier. We have a rich history, you know. Like I said, you know, earlier in my submission, the problem is the mind of Africans. We have done the political, you know, liberation, but the mental liberation is yet to happen. That is the reason why our educational system is still fashioned in the same colonial manner. We still have colonial curriculums in our schools. We have great stories to talk about. You know, in Kenya, you have Namaratonga in Kenya. This was an observatory. Our ancestors were mapping the movement of the stars like Bellatrix, Aldebaran, Central Orion, and so on and so forth. For 700 years, Africans would rule and civilize Europe. The first university in Europe, called the University of Salamanca, was built by Black Africans like you and me, our ancestors. The University of Salamanca, the first major university in Europe, was built by Africans. We have a rich history. The richest man to ever walk on the surface of the earth, Emperor Mansa Musa, was from Timbuktu in Mali. This is our story. It's not just about savage Africans that got civilized by Europeans. It's the other way around. After all, this is an historical fact. You know, Europeans didn't even know that they could have common bath. Waking up in the morning and having your bath in Europe was considered a diabolical practice until Africans went and ruled Europe for 700 years. The common bath was introduced to Europeans by Africans. This is our story. I can go on and on. But talking about unity, the problem is that, most of our states, most of our nations are states. Now, there's a difference between a state and a nation. A nation is a group of people that share the same language, culture, tradition, and so on and so forth. But a state is a confluence of multiple nations. What we are doing is that because again, we are still running on the colonial structures, we have failed to have honest conversation among ourselves to say, brother, sister, we are from multiple nations. We have, some of us, our indigenous nations have got civilizations that goes back as far as 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. We fell. Today, we are all, as a result of Eurocentric mapping of the continent, we are now in the same countries. Can we have honest conversation and run our countries as true federalism? Can we run our countries as true federalism? Can we have a confederacy with the center holding us together? But at the regional levels or at the state levels, we can chart our own courses. Let us have the same military, share the same currency, and have the same foreign affairs and have the same foreign affairs policy. The day-to-day running.
I think the interesting thing, which we all know, is the fact that we've been having these conversations about, minimizing the barriers, the land barriers, having the common currency that you spoke about. But we all also know that we haven't achieved much in that area. And I want us to discuss that when we come back. When we return, we'll also talk about neocolonialism and modern day slavery. You're here on The Square. Don't go away. Welcome back to Village Square Africa. Today on the program, we are discussing Africa Day. We have looked at, 60 years of independence on the continent and the journey so far, the tasks ahead to handle. Still with us here, Maliba Arnold, who is a public policy analyst, is joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. We also have Tamunokuro Iyo Obietonbara, a Pan Africanist, is joining us from Abuja, Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. I'll move on to Maliba now. Maliba, again, we're still on the storytelling because as Tamuno is telling us, there is the need for mental liberation as well. And I strongly believe that starts with knowing our story, knowing the kind of people that we are. But when you look around, just a cursory look at, the anthropologists who are digging up our ancestors, the anthropologists who are learning about our ancestors, they are mostly not people like you and I. Why is Africa not interested in learning about its own ancestors? And what should we do to get our leaders to do some of these things?
I think we need to move away from only looking up to our leaders. It's important that probably young Africans now rise up and realize that our story is singular and our fate is actually one. Because whatever way you are going to look at these issues, we still are united, not just by geography, but also history and how the world looks at us and how the world perceives us. If we're going to, you initially spoke about unity, and the problem of unity would be around language. I will still go back to language because you're not able to tell a story without necessarily having language as a tool or a medium through which you're going to tell the story. It's been difficult for Africans, for example, to fuse. We were always here before we became Francophone and before we became Anglophones. But today, even within the AU, you realize that people lobby along those lines that are actually foreign to the African culture. We now are more European more than we are African, at least when we look at the official institutions. So a small country like Britain, for example, can sustain. When I was still young, I would listen to BBC Swahili, for example, broadcasting across the Eastern Africa region. But the whole of Africa, as we are as a people, we are not able, for example, to put up a channel that will propagate a language. For example, we say Swahili is Africa's widely spoken language, with about about 400 million people can actually get into Swahili. We've not gotten onto that. He earlier on spoke about the issue of a currency. You know, the reason why the dollar is up there and our currencies sometimes look like rubbish is because those guys have simply planted differences in us. You have got a product, I want that particular product, I have money, but you cannot accept my currency, yet I want the product you have. So the dollar simply becomes a broker currency that is acceptable by the other side, and then it's also acceptable this side. So why have we, for example, allowed the dollar to be brokering us? Because whenever it's used in between, it has to actually get commission on both sides. And by doing that, it actually erodes the wealth that we have. The other thing is, you look at intra-Africa infrastructure. Sometimes just crossing from one African country to another is actually much longer than it is to leave Africa and go to another continent. Sometimes actually moving across Africa, it involves you going through another continent before you can actually come back to Africa, as in interconnectivity. So even trading amongst ourselves, we've not traded amongst ourselves sufficiently the way the guys who sat in Berlin and decided to draw boundaries on pencil, and we have made them look like they actually are made of iron. So there is the mentality. He spoke about the mental colonialism, how we need to change that. In our minds, actually, there is a serious iron wall that is actually fed by concepts of colonialism. We still look at the West as the best place to go. Until recently, the West was the best example anyone would look at. But then they brought us, for example, Christianity. And now we see them veering off what they taught us. That is when we realize it's different.
Indeed.
We have forgotten the revolution that came with the Second World War. When our ancestors went to the Second World War, of course, talking about slavery, when our ancestors went to fight on the side of different colonial groups, they then realized that these people are just human like us. Our ancestors who were least learned, more as in they were less learned than we are today. When they came from the Second World War, they realized that if they launched armed struggle, that if they put up agitation, if they pushed hard, they would become independent. It took a small years for them to actually see that. Indeed. Today, you have got a generation of educated Africans.
Indeed. You know, for the sake of time, I want us to move right along and talk about neocolonialism and modern day slavery as captured in the Walk-Free report on the Global Slavery Index. Now, the report indicates that modern day slavery, or Africans, are especially vulnerable to modern day slavery. Tamuno, I know we may have identified a few of the problems, but does this come to you as a surprise? And why is the continent particularly vulnerable to modern slavery?
Well, you know, we do not have the level of political stability, the level of economic power, the level of military power that is needed to shield us, to protect us. We don't have it, so we are vulnerable. You know, I keep using North Korea as an example. You know, I keep telling people that North Korea has got more military might than the whole of Africa put together. We should be ashamed of ourselves. You know, these are issues. These are serious. These are existential crisis. You know, in Congo alone, you know, in the southeastern provinces of Congo, in the coltan and cobalt mines, we have over 100,000 children that are working in those mines. In Ghana and in Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, we have at least, in Ghana and in Ivory Coast, we have at least 2 million children, you know, working in the cocoa plantations. On the 18th of June, something happened on the 18th of June, 2021. 5 African men sued Nestle and Cargill, you know, in the U.S. Supreme Court. But guess what? The U.S. Supreme Court struck out the case. Now, what was the case about? The case was that these five African men, you know, were kidnapped as children in Mali. They were kidnapped and taken to work in cocoa plantations in Ivory Coast. And they were working for 12 to 14 hours every single day. But they eventually escaped, and somehow they reconnected And as adults, they decided to take the case up against Nestle and Cargill because they found out that Nestle and Cargill is this is a case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court. They found out that Cargill and Nestle are responsible. They are the ones orchestrating and steering the modern slavery.
They've turned a blind eye to it.
No, they are steering it. They are the perpetrators of this. According to the suit that was filed, they perpetuate this crisis, this modern slavery, so as to be able to have cheap labor and to keep the prices, the prices of cocoa, down, so that they can easily afford it. And if you go to Libya, for instance, right now in Libya we have at least 500,000 sub-Saharan Africans in Libya. Trapped in Libya, most of them in slave camps. They are being sold for $300. You must have had the report, or you must have seen the report. They're being sold for as cheap as $200. These are human beings. Our fellow Africans being sold for $200, $250, $300. And in most cases, they're being sold to organ traffickers. Their organs are they get killed. Their organs are vested. This is happening in Africa today. And the reason it's happening is because of the instabilities that we see all around Africa. And I tell you this, that most of the crises we have in Africa that makes us vulnerable are crises that are instigated from outside to keep us where we are, so that our resources will continue to be exploited, both human and natural resources. So we have to wake up as a people. This is neocolonialism at work here. Neocolonialism is tied together with modern slavery. Now, let me give you an example. Do you know that for each transaction we conduct on the continent, someone outside the continent benefits? Let me explain. Let's say I want to buy something in Ghana. Ghana is just right here, or maybe Chad, or maybe Niger, or Cameroon. Of course, they wouldn't accept the Naira, and I wouldn't accept the CFA. So what do we use in trade? We use the dollar, we use the euro, and the pounds. So each time I buy something in Ghana, someone in New York or someone in Washington is having commissions. Each time I buy any product across the continent, someone either in London or in Paris or in New York or in Washington benefits from it. So we are trading among ourselves as Africans using these currencies. This is neocolonialism at work. So where is the economic independence? If we have to rely on the currencies of our historical enemies to trade, because the truth of the matter is that these people are our historical enemies. We don't have to hide it or shy away from it. We just have to look at history to see what has happened to us from these countries I just mentioned. So there is so much we need to do. Like I said, we've been able to achieve some level of progress, but the journey is still far. Collectively, we have to rise up and work and ensuring that we have a continent that works for all of us.
Winding down. Maliba, you mentioned earlier, that because of the circumstances on the continent, we find a lot of people moving away. And, again, the exchange rates, you do you pay meager salaries out there, but because when you change that dollar, the euro, to your local currency, it's a lot of money. How do you convince the African people, particularly the young people, that, to draw the line between that honest and dignifying work and their bread and butter issues, because that is where we get stuck at?
If we are able, I do not believe, for example, that we need to have military power that could match anyone around here. I think that to unify Africa, I still believe that trade, intra-African trade, would actually solve a lot of these problems. That once we actually trade with each other, there would be infrastructure, there would be kinship, there would be, invested interests, where now, on both ends, people know that we are dependent on each other. Otherwise, the story of divide and rule, as sold to us by the people who came here to colonize us, still works now differently, because like Kwame Nkrumah said that they will be back, the colonialists will be back, but in a different way. We see they are back, and we see how they actually are dealing with us. Somehow, we are now voluntarily getting in, we are getting colonized voluntarily. Number one, through debt. But you will see, like in Kenya, there is I don't know whether to call it a wave of people who cannot get jobs going to the Middle East to work as domestic workers, whereas the pay could actually look like it's a little bit elevated. We are receiving a lot of them who actually come back dead. The way they live on the other side is not dignified. We have got cases of domestic workers coming back home abused, dead. The cases are rather too many. You look online and there are so many. But African countries not having the backbone to speak up, like the AU is unable to speak up. You remember the Kenyan president the other day said that the way we are being treated across the world is unfair. That you're going to meet the French president and all of us, 52 or 54 countries, all of us, we send representatives and we are going to meet one person. Even just allow, if you are to look at it around governance, the way you do a board meeting, how productive is a meeting of 52 people meeting one person? It doesn't make so much sense. You are not able to get so much. You realize that those particular meetings are one way. It is one person who's speaking to the many, and the voices of the many are actually considered as noise, and then they end up signing things they don't understand. Indeed. So I think, like I mentioned the Second World War revolution, when our ancestors, our great-grandfathers and grandfathers who went to the Second World War came back, when they were there, they realized that these people were human. They could die by bullets. They would cry. They were also afraid. They were not superhumans. When they came back home, the pressure for for independence actually mounted. I think Africans have now traveled. We've got so many people out there. And rather than sell the story, the sob story, the bad stories about Africa, it will really change even how we do governance. There is something that we don't like talking about, and that is politics. You know, we cannot have the least qualified. Let me use this example. It might not be necessarily nice, but then in my village, where I come from in Western Kenya, when I was young, my father used to tell me that the person who would not pass exams would end up being a priest, would go to the military. And some of those aspects that are very important were places where we would take the least educated. Today, you find the best of Africans do not want to participate in the governance of the countries they come from. But they are very sharp on social media, criticizing and saying everything else. You know,
you're right.
This is a political problem.
You're absolutely right.
We need an awakening where we stop being analysts online about governance, and we cannot fold our sleeves and go down there and try to fix these things.
Very well.
We cannot make politics.
I'm afraid I'd have to cut you. We have very little time, and I want to hear from Tamunokuro before we go. Tamunokuro, you mentioned, those global players or the players in the global economy and how complicit they are in modern day slavery on the continent, in their own home countries. What action can be taken, perhaps, not particularly, but perhaps, by the African Union to ensure or hold these global players accountable for their roles in modern day slavery?
Again, we have to go back to the word unity. Unity. Because unless we work together, unless we have a common purpose collectively as a continent, it will be very easy for anyone to distract us. Unity is just the key word here. This is not something one person can fight alone. We saw what Muammar Gaddafi, hate him or love him, but we all saw what he was trying to do for the continent, and they see the way he ended up. We've seen African leaders that have tried to change the narrative by themselves. Look at how all of them ended up. From Mozambique, Samora Michel, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba. This is my personal opinion. I keep questioning how John Magufuli of Tanzania was, how he died. I keep questioning. The official stories are yet to make sense to me. So each time we have someone who comes out to change the narrative, that person ends up being killed or is removed from power. So the African Union, if they should go back in 1963, they should go back. Our African leaders should go back and read the speech that Kwame Nkrumah made in Addis Ababa, 1963. That Kwame Nkrumah speech, has all the solutions we are looking for. It wasn't just a speech. It was also it was loaded with solutions. If we can implement the suggestions of the Kwame Nkrumah group in 1963, the Monrovia group, if we can implement, what they suggested, then I'm sure that we can keep these global players at bay.
I'm afraid
if I may just round up.
I'm afraid we would have. Well, quickly.
If I may just round up, climate change is also, because I saw the report, climate change is another big problem for Africa. It's also, one of the things that has kept us vulnerable. Now, if you look at the statistics, Africa contributes less than 3% to climate change. Less than 3%. So we're contributing nothing. I'm not saying 3% is absolutely nothing. You have China 30-something%, the US almost 20-something%, Asia is contributing around 50-60-something%.
Indeed.
Africa less than 3%.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave our conversation here for now. We'll put a pin in it and pick it up again at a better time. But thank you, gentlemen, for your insights on the matter, Tamunokuro and Maliba. Well, that'll be all today on The Square. We are back Monday with fresh new discussions here on the program. But remember that alongside with political emancipation must come mental emancipation as well. Telling our own story, learning about our own story. We hope you get into that going forward. I am Keminni Amanor. Have a wonderful weekend. See you some other time. Bye-bye.